third hearing, consider a local law, adding a new section 285-37-2 in the zoning ordinance of the town of Greenburgh related to solar energy systems. I'd like to move that.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And just so you know, we're not going to be closing the hearing. This particular hearing is a fairly complex law and of many pages. And so if anybody cannot speak tonight or doesn't speak tonight, they'll have another opportunity at the next town board meeting.
Right, and we're also checking to see how it comports with the potential state law.
Okay, we should have an explanation.
Yeah, Garrett's on.
Okay, very good. Good evening, Supervisor Feiner and Town Council members. For the record, again, Garrett Duquesne, Commissioner of the Department of Community Development and Conservation. The subject of the public hearing this evening relates to a proposed local law establishing a new section of the zoning ordinance, section 285-37.2, entitled Solar Energy Systems, and related modifications to section 285.5 definitions, which support the new law. In giving an overview of the proposed law, I'd like to overlap that with the process that led us to this point. The town board appointed Sustainability and Energy Efficiency Committee, or SEEC, identified solar infrastructure as its first priority as a committee and worked with town staff to understand ways in which solar installations have successfully been implemented across the town and worked with town staff to understand any barriers to potentially good solar type installations. And lastly, looked at examples of how other communities are regulating solar uses. The SEEC's research ultimately concluded that a solar law would be beneficial for the town and worked closely with the CD&C Deputy Commissioner, Aaron Schmidt, who is the primary author of the draft. The draft solar local law provides for 4 distinct tiers or categories of solar installations. The SEEC, in its research, learned that the town's building department successfully processes a significant number of rooftop solar applications for both commercial and residential properties. In preparing for the meeting tonight, I randomly did an aerial view scan of Executive Park in Elmsford portion of the town, and I was very impressed with the level of solar investment. I'll share screen and show you what I saw. So for frame of reference, this is actually, of course, the ShopRite, which is now finished. But when I scanned over here, this is the first area I thought to go to. You look at a lot of these rooftops and the small checkerboard darker grids are photovoltaic solar systems. So, you know, it's tremendous what the investments that have been done here in the town of Greenburgh. And again, this is the Elmsford portion of the town. And, you know, it just goes on, and it's you know, just great sustainable energy.
That's great.
So I did a similar scan of the Parkway Gardens neighborhood, and I must say I was very similarly impressed, and I just want to give you a quick snippet of what that looks like. So right up from Town Hall, I took a look at the Jefferson Place area, South Road, and you know, you can just get a sense. You just see the magnitude and the proportion of solar on homes. You know, it's getting to the point where it's more homes have solar than not.
You know how many homes have solar now?
So I can look to have statistics provided, but in speaking with the buildings department today, they indicated they can get 6 applications in one day. It's, you know, it's staggering, but I think it's a good question, and I would like to somehow quantify that. So we will seek to get statistics. And the fact is, you can do what I just did in any part of the town, and what you'll see is just intense levels of solar, whether it's, you know, residential neighborhoods or commercial, anywhere in the town. So the SEEC therefore concluded that there is not a local regulatory barrier to these types of rooftop solar installations. And as such, the local law identifies both residential and rooftop solar installations as Tier 1 solar category, with the proposed process remaining essentially the same as it is today. Administratively approved through the building department pursuant to New York State Building and Fire Code. In short, if it's not broke, don't fix it. The second category of solar that is covered in the local law is known as Tier 2 solar. These are small-scale ground-mounted systems proposed to be permitted as accessory uses in all zoning districts of the town on lots containing a residential structure and subject to height, setback, coverage, screening, and fencing requirements. There's actually very few of these types of installations in the town, despite this type of solar presently being enabled generally as an accessory structure. The benefit of codifying these types of systems in the manner which is proposed is the addition of coverage and screening requirements which do not presently exist. And I'd like to share an example of a Tier 2 system. Now, this system is not a Greenburgh example. It's just one that I've driven by several times, but ultimately it gives you the flavor. So this is an example of a solar Tier 2 ground mount where the rooftop in this particular instance is not conducive to solar, but they had a quite large lawn. And in this instance, again, outside of the town of Greenburgh, this just gives you a good sense of what that type 2 system would look like. You may have noticed that that was in the front yard of that house, that property. For reference purposes, Tier 2 in the town of Greenburgh would be permitted only in side and rear yards. Okay, the third category of solar that is covered in the local law is known as Tier 3 solar. These systems are ground-mounted systems proposed to be permitted as accessory uses, essentially in the non-residential districts, the CB, DS, CA, HC, OB, OB1, LOB, IB, PD, PED, LI, and GI zoning districts of the town. And these systems would be subject to height, setback coverage, screening, fencing, and signage requirements. There are a few of these types of installations in the town, despite this type also being presently enabled generally as an accessory structure. At present in the zoning ordinance, however, there is no metric to determine at what size an amended site plan process should be triggered. What is proposed in the local law is a lot size based proportional solar ground mount area ratio, which if exceeded, sets forth a requirement for amended site plan and special permit approval. So in short, simple terms, a small scale ground mount solar installation in an office park, as example, would proceed straight to building permit, whereas a mid-scale or large-scale commercial ground mount system would be required to obtain site plan and special permit approval. The rationale for this is that the mid-scale and large-scale ground mount systems, they have a greater potential to impact vehicular site circulation or have aesthetic impacts, and the site plan and special permit process are a good way to ensure that safe, compatible solar installations occur. I believe, as did the SEEC, that the legible rules for these Tier 2 and Tier 3 type installations provide a good balance of efficiency and oversight into the process and will not act as barriers to good solar developments. So I would like to show you a picture of a sample type 3. And again, we're talking non-residential zones and commercial properties. So this example is not in the town of Greenburgh. This is actually a school in New Jersey, but this is what we're talking about with Tier 3. Solar installations in a paved parking lot area. So this is, in this example, this would be the type of installation, if this were the town of Greenburgh on a lot of similar size, that would go for amended site plan and require special permit. Okay, the fourth and last category of solar that is covered in the local law is known as Tier 4 solar. These systems are large-scale ground mount systems enabled through what is known as an overlay zoning district. Presently, the town has one such overlay district known as the Conservation Overlay District, which has been effectively implemented in various locations in the town. The proposed solar overlay district, if approved by the town board for a site, would then authorize that site owner to apply for site plan and special permit approval for a solar farm. The best way to describe a solar farm is, again, through a visual. So I'm going to share screen with a sample solar farm, and this example is not in the town of Greenburgh. So this example is in the town of Poughkeepsie, and it's at the, I believe, the Oakwood Friends School. And it's, let's see here. It's a private school on Spackenkill Road off of Route 9. So I'm on Google Earth, and this is a sample solar farm on a tier 4 example. So this array of panels, they're running east to west, southern facing, sun exposure. I would say that this surface area is probably an acre or more on, a lot of many acres. This is the whole school. So this just gives you a sense and a visual of what we mean when we say solar farm.
May I ask a question? Or are
Of
you?
course.
Okay, so something like that, for instance, that large solar array, can you equate that to how much power it would provide, like X amount? Does it provide for that whole facility and then some, and then, some subsets of that to just give people a sense of what the benefits of a solar array is?
Very good. I will obtain that information, but that is a significant system, and I will speculate at this moment that more than covers all of the energy needs for that site. But it is a great question, and I will, at the next public hearing, have quantified solar benefits from a megawatt perspective.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Before you begin, Deputy Building Inspector Liz Garrity texted and said that they have 180 solar permits a year approximately. From 2020 to 2023, there were 556 solar install permits issued.
That's awesome. Very good. Very good news. All right. So in Greenburgh, the solar overlay district would be applicable in all zoning districts for properties exceeding a minimum of 4 acres and meeting applicable setbacks, height requirements, and meeting buffer and screening requirements. The approval process for a solar overlay is the same legislative and discretionary process that the town board utilizes for all zoning map amendments. In addition to the broad discretion that the town board is afforded in approving zoning map changes. In addition to the broad zoning discretion. The local law also includes a prioritization guide as follows. Prioritize paved parking areas over natural treeless areas, and prioritize natural treeless areas over treed areas. The guide is not a mandate for town board approval, but a guide to help the board in its consideration. Any proposal for an overlay district would include a referral to the planning board for recommendation. The town board would also hold a public hearing for any proposal. I think it's important to give examples. I would like to give 2 brief examples to highlight planning considerations for a hypothetical tier 4 proposal in the context of the proposed draft solar law. And these examples will be in the town of Greenburgh. The first example is actually a site that a developer had interest in purchasing several years ago for a solar farm and actually sought town board support back then. So I'm now going to share screen, show you this site and talk about it. Okay, so the site I have on the screen, it's in the East Irvington portion of the town. The site is zoned 1 family residential and it exceeds 4 acres. It's actually an approximately 10-acre site. And let's just assume that one could easily meet the required setbacks for a solar farm on this site. So this is the 10-acre site in yellow, of course.
You're not sharing?
Oh, thank you very much. Here we go. Thank you for that. All right, so again, 10-acre site in East Irvington. Some of the town board members will recall that there was much interest in this site to have it convert to a solar farm, and it even rose to the level of that developer coming to a town board work session. All right, so for hypothetical purposes, if the local law that is being presented were in place today, here's some of the planning considerations of note. The site is heavily wooded, and from a priority perspective in the law, the site ranks as low as possible. The site sits adjacent to the Taxter Ridge Park Preserve. Clear-cutting a majority of a property adjacent to a park preserve is not good for numerous and obvious environmental reasons. The site is within a conservation district overlay, the goals of which are to preserve natural features. If the solar law were in place today and a developer sought to apply for a solar overlay district at this site, myself or any one of my staff would relay these facts to the developer, and I see no scenario where a rational developer would entertain the idea beyond that initial phone call. In addition to all the reasons I have stated why this site is not a viable candidate for a solar overlay zone, I also note that when the developer did present to the town board at a work session years ago, residents came out and had the opportunity to speak. They made similar points, which the town board heard and respected and made clear that this is not a viable site. In the unlikely scenario where a developer refused to acknowledge the facts noted above and was insistent on submitting an application, the town board would have the discretion to deny such a solar overlay petition. All right, so I'm going to give a second example, and this one is going to be quite different. All right, so I want to call your attention to the screen for another 10-acre site, which I have my cursor on here. Did it switch to a different aerial?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so this 10-acre site is on Lawrence Street in the Ardsley portion of the town in the GI General Industrial District. The site is a former brownfield site that originally housed a chemical manufacturing use and has since been remediated to a non-residential use standard as part of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Brownfield Cleanup Program. The site is largely treeless in its southern 7 or so acres. The site does abut the South County Trailway. So in this hypothetical, if the solar law were in place today and a developer sought to apply for a solar overlay district at the site, from a planning perspective and with the knowledge that I have of the local law, as town staff, I would not hesitate to connect the potential developer with the town board for a pre-submission conference. I would still submit that the town board in this example would not be obligated to approve a solar overlay. But if the town board, following the process and with public input that was supportive, I believe this would certainly be a viable candidate. So those are two examples. And what I want to do is just conclude with the planning board insight into this process.
Garrett, can I ask a question also?
Of course.
So just in a nutshell, are brownfields good candidates for solar overlays?
Yeah, in general, I think they could certainly be.
Do they need to be
The
remediated
nature of a
first,
brownfield
or-
by definition is contamination.
Yeah.
So in general, just, you know, on a almost philosophical level, the transformation from, contaminated site to sustainable green energy is just a wonderful story. So in that sense, it strikes me as in all likelihood, a brownfield could be a great candidate. But having said that, that's just one factor. And public input would contribute, view sheds would contribute. There's a whole variety of factors that would contribute.
I remember, because
I didn't finish.
Yeah,
Is there any aspect to a brownfield not being remediated that would make it not a good candidate for solar overlay?
I think that there would have to be some level of cleanup because ultimately you have technicians that tend to the site periodically, and there would have to be some level of cleanup, and it probably would lend itself towards the lower end of spectrum of cleanup standards, which is okay in instances as long as the areas adjacent are protected from that, whatever the contamination was in that instance. But in general, I think the premise of brownfield to this type of use is certainly a good idea.
And for clarity, you used an example, the parcel on Lawrence Street, which has been cleaned up to a non-residential use. Would that be the lower end, or is that some step higher?
So the gold standard of environmental cleanup is the residential standard.
Right.
And an example of that in the town is the Chelsea on Dobbs Ferry Road, the assisted living facility, major contamination, major contaminated brownfield site, and that was cleaned up to the gold standard. This site is a non-residential standard. I will not say that it's the lowest standard that it was cleaned up to, but it certainly was not cleaned up to a standard that you could have any type of residential.
And I would imagine the town board would have some say as to the level of cleanup that we would permit if we were to grant the solar. Correct?
Yes, if it was pre-cleanup, by all means, and you knew of the end potential use, that's certainly something that a land use board like the town board would want to factor in and make comments on.
Is that something that we want to think about and look into and think about including in the law?
Do you mean in terms of, say, identifying brownfields as potentially higher type candidates, higher ranked candidates, if you will?
Well, I think in identifying the level of cleanup that would be necessary should a brownfield be considered.
Well,
Let me think of, I'll think about that as we go into the next meeting. I'm going to add that to my list of updates to provide for the board at the next meeting. It's a good question. I would like to think about that some more.
Ask a follow-up question to that, because I wrote a bunch of letters a couple years ago to the owner of the property suggesting a solar, like a solar farm. There was a lot of opposition in the community to apartments, and people in Ardsley are concerned about, traffic. If we, and I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm saying that the state DEC sets standards for the type of cleanup for different types of developments.
Uses.
And I remember the conversations I had, with the state DEC, and I think even with the owners of the property. This was probably right after the Jefferson was rejected. If there's a higher level of cleanup, then the owner of the property may want to have, a more developed property.
Right.
So it could really work, both ways. If the state DEC says that this is all that's needed and it's healthy and safe, and they could prove that there's no safety issues, it may be an advantage of the immediate neighbors to have something, a project that's going to have zero traffic. I'm just throwing that out,
that's a
and I'm
good
not
point.
saying you're wrong. I'm just saying.
Oh,
that's
no,
not wrong.
and it's not a right or wrong,
No,
it's
I don't
just
think it's
saying
right or
that, taking that into consideration if we were to add something to the law.
I'm suggesting that we shouldn't go lower than the commercial standard. We
Right.
don't need residential standard to put a solar farm, but we should at least have a commercial standard for a solar farm.
And, maybe what we could also do is reach out to, say, the state DEC and maybe some expert, maybe some of the environmental and health organizations, and ask them to give us their opinion on the standards that they would feel, should be, met. Because I don't want to be, taking a risk, saying, okay, you got a solar farm, but you don't have to clean it up as much as one, and then 5 years later, people are getting cancer or something because we weren't as active. But I think that if we do our due diligence and reach out to people who really understand the field, then we could come up with the regulations that are needed.
Well, I wouldn't be
Parents
surprised,
are
we're not the first to consider this, and there might be
Right.
other studies
Or even independent, it doesn't have to be the DEC, it could be, there's all these, like a NIPERG or a health advocacy group or Riverkeeper, they might be able to give us Federated Conservations, they might be able to give us independent advice, and then we could base the decision we need on them.
Definitely some good options, Garrett. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'd just like to quickly conclude with the planning board recommendation. Okay, so the planning board discussed the local law referral on November 1st, November 15th, and December 6th of 2023. The planning board issued a report which was supportive of the local law and issued a positive recommendation, which it amended on one occasion. The planning board's recommendation with respect to incorporating a lot-sized ratio threshold for ground mount panels in Tier 3 systems, as well as a recommendation to provide setback waivers where topography or the adjacency of a major highway exists, warrant flexibility. Those recommendations are built into the local law and draft that has been posted as part of the public hearing this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well done. We know that you put a
As
lot of
usual.
work into this.
You did.
Thanks. And I just quickly I do want to thank Deputy Commissioner Aaron Schmidt, who did the lion's share of work on this, and both the planning board and the SEEC for the hours they put in as well. Thank you.
Thank you.